Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Jim Ferguson, and this is the Freedom Train International Special Report. Tonight, we bring you a broadcast that cuts through the noise and gets straight to the truth. At a time when truth has become one of the rarest commodities in public life. Across Canada, the United Kingdom, and right across Europe, people are waking up to the same reality. A world where governments have stopped listening. Where institutions that once protected the public now protect themselves. And where speaking honestly can cost you your job, your reputation, or even your freedom. But here on Freedom Train International, we stand firm. We do not bend, we do not bow, and we do not apologize for asking the questions the mainstream is too afraid to ask. Tonight's program unfolds in 4 powerful parts, and each one reveals a different piece of the global picture. Different voices, different countries, different stories, but one unmistakable thread: truth breaking through the cracks. Part 1 takes us to Canada, where Peter sits down with Jim McMurtry, a teacher fired for simply challenging a government narrative. What happened to him should terrify every democratic nation. A man punished not for wrongdoing, but for telling the truth, as the historical record actually shows it. Tonight, he reveals the documents, the legal evidence, and the historical reality behind the indigenous land claims sweeping across British Columbia. Claims that threaten private property rights, national unity, and the rule of law across the entire country. This conversation is not just about Canada. It is a warning to every nation sleepwalking into the same trap.
Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another segment of Freedom Train International, sponsored by Jim Ferguson out of the UK. Tonight's guest from West Coast Canada is Jim McMurtry, and here's a guy who's got the real in-depth knowledge of the level of censorship and totalitarianism creeping into Canada, every bit as bad as what you folks are seeing in the UK right now and in other areas around the world. So Jim is one of those guys who was willing to stand up and paid a real heavy price for it. Jim, I think what I'm going to do is why don't I give you 2 minutes just to tell folks your version of who you are, how popular you've become in Canada for standing up and doing the right thing. And we'll lead into your book. And then from there, let's talk about the debacle that's going on out there right now for land claims.
I'm honored to be with you, Peter. The first thing I'd like to say is that I'm pretty much a nobody. I had a father who was famous. He was the Chief Justice and Attorney General of Ontario and the CEO of our football league and all sorts of things. So I had a quieter career. I was a teacher. And the only reason I have any notoriety today is that I was walked out of classroom and career for telling students the truth about history. And so I think I've distinguished myself. I'm certainly trying to on X as somebody who is uncensored and principled. And courageous. I think that's the one thing that many people lack is the courage of one's convictions. And I think the saddest thing of all right now is to see what this woke program has done to schools. I was lucky enough to be featured in a Telegram documentary in Britain, and it's called Canada's Woke Nightmare with Jordan Peterson and others. And so, there are people in Britain might remember the name. Again, a BC teacher who was telling people something that was just common knowledge to anyone with any sort of understanding of our history. And I have a PhD from the University of Toronto in the area, and I still, it didn't matter. I was kicked out of the profession for saying that the kids that died at residential schools, Indian residential schools, indigenous residential schools, did so from disease, in some cases accidents, fires, but not from murder. So there was a story in 2021 of 215 children being murdered by their teachers in one school. and the site of a former residential school, again in Kamloops, British Columbia, in the interior of the province. And so it was just so counterintuitive. Teachers don't murder students, and it made no sense because the school was right in the heart of the reserve. It's right in the heart of a fairly big city for again, interior British Columbia, called again Kamloops. The parents were right there. The chiefs, the people are coming in and out of the school all the time. Indian agents, doctors, nurses, and so forth. Half the staff, if not more, were indigenous: cooks, cleaners, dormitory supervisors. There were, in the 1960s, there were 3 teachers, and into the 70s, 3 teachers were indigenous, and a principal for a long time in the 70s was indigenous. So the whole thing is, and yet, in a pretty outrageous act of pantomime, our prime minister at the time, Justin Trudeau, went around the world really with this story. I mean, there were flags were taken down, Canadian flags were dropped all around the world for 5 months, and that Canada the next year, this is in 2021, the next year voted itself a genocidal state. I don't think that will ever happen again in human history. A country voting itself genocidal when it never was genocide. It was always beneficent relative to other countries. I mean, I'm very proud Canadian, and so it's very upsetting. And so what's happening? I think it's perhaps moot, whatever, but it does seem as though there's international forces that want to create some sort of chaos, almost like a Charles Manson helter skelter in this country, and pit races against each other. In this particular case, by taking away ordinary Canadians' property rights and saying that the indigenous control the whole country. So the original sin for Canada, according to these people on the political left, the extreme political left, is that we weren't good to our indigenous people, and particularly in residential schools, and that just wasn't true at all. So it's very much a hoax. They didn't find us, and then other bands right across Canada pretended that they themselves had found all these markers of buried children who were murdered by their teachers all across the country. In a number of places they did dig, but they've never dug in Kamloops because there's just no evidence that there was even a single child buried at the school, because there were death records for almost all the kids. So we know where the kids were buried, and they never buried them at the school. So anyhow, it's just, it's quite shocking. And I think if there's any lesson for people, it's just that you cannot trust your own government to do your thinking for you.
Whoops. We talk about that all the time, Jim. One of the points I do want to bring up, then I'm going to go back and get you to tell the story from where it really started, that day in school, what you had done. But if we want to talk about genocide in Canada, just to set the record straight, this is stuff I was never taught in school. And I actually only found it out this year by starting to do deep research. And one of the things, Jim, is one of the true genocides that happened in Canada were the Iroquois slaughtering the Huron. There used to be a tribe of Hurons with roughly 30,000 of them. And the Iroquois decimated them down to roughly 2,000, taking their women as slaves. So the only genocide that I'm aware of in Canada was actually the Iroquois basically wiping out the Huron tribes. And then I learned another thing I hadn't learned in Nova Scotia was that the Mi'kmaq tribes, I went to Newfoundland and basically wiped out the Beothuk. I grew up in school thinking that Europeans had wiped out the Beothuk in Newfoundland, and it wasn't. It was the Mi'kmaq. And so I'm looking at 2 genocides, and the only 2 that I can find in Canada, unfortunately, get dumped back in the lap of indigenous tribes. So explain a little bit more about what actually happened that day to you in the school system in BC.
I'd be happy to do it. And I just say to you, it was perpetual conflict with our indigenous peoples. They were nomadic, warring, hunting people. There was cannibalism. There was slavery. There was horrible forms of torture. We know that because when we were in school long ago, we learned about 2 Catholic priests, Brébeuf and Lademont, who had their internal organs, particularly the heart, taken out and consumed, and And so this idea that the people who built Canada, which is, mostly people from Britain, that they were also guilty of genocide is absurd. There was a time under our first prime minister when the third biggest expense for the federal government in the whole year was on feeding prairie indigenous people, because they went through a very difficult period with obviously the diminution of the buffalo and almost near extinction of their primary food source. So what happened to me in the classroom is I mean, it's hard to be a teacher. It's hard to be a public school teacher, a private school, any teacher right now, because it used to be about education and debate and challenging kids, testing their ideas and disciplining them and giving essays and tests and exams. Anyhow, so there's so much that's just gone from many, many schools. So I think a lot of people go back and do school today and be quite surprised. And the saddest thing, I think, is there's a program of indoctrination that the political left has got its tentacles, the high priests of the woke cult have got its tentacles into all aspects of a school. So if I could just quickly say the 6 things that really bothered me stand out, and then I'll just say a little bit more about my teaching that day. And that is that they're talking about sex and deviant sex and trans sex and pansexuality and all these things with little kids, and having drag queens coming in and putting little kindergarten kids on their laps. Well, of course, that's what these drag queens want. This is their autoerotism. This is how they get off. I mean, we're just using children. They're still asking kids in kindergarten right across Canada, what are their pronouns? Oh my gosh, why are you introducing any notion of sexuality or sexual orientation with kids as young as kindergarten? The next one and it's gotten a little bit better, but there's this horrible, it's sort of a race communism. You can't have some races more successful than others. Well, that's not really true, because professional sport is predominantly Black, but nobody has a complaint with that. But they don't like it when there's maybe more doctors or maybe more engineers who are one race rather than over another race. So the schools are working so hard to level, giving fewer and fewer opportunities to the kids who are from groups that traditionally did well, and so many to the ones that didn't do well. And so my children went to law school, and one place that they applied to was the University of Victoria, and none of my kids got in there. And what they do there, if you're Indigenous, for example, you can apply to the University of Victoria Law School. You don't need to have a degree. You don't need to write the test, the intelligent quotient test, to get you in there, or the general knowledge test called as people know, the LSAT. And in addition to that, you don't have to compete with marks. They're just filling up a quota of 8%. Maybe it's higher now. So it's quite shocking that the race stuff as well, having kids getting marked, having my principal come and speak to teachers at our school if they weren't giving high enough marks to kids who are Black or Hispanic or Indigenous. The third thing is the Indigenous thing, and this idea that their knowledge is superior to Western science and daily land acknowledgements and changing everything, even changing textbooks right now. So it's not about 2 trains passing in the night going at these relative speeds. It's about 2 canoes. I mean, everything right now is though these, first of all, Indigenous people are museum pieces arrested in time. And anyhow, just nonsense, because you're getting rid of so many textbooks. You have no textbooks left because they're expensive to replace. The next thing is just the onslaught about going against academic values, against having kids do work, having kids being accountable, having the teacher in charge. Now the teacher is discredited if he or she is running the class. Much better to have the kids just doing presentations in groups and having nobody listening, and again, having no intellectual accountability. And very quickly, the fifth thing is about literature. But so many good books are coming in, after generations there, like To Kill a Mockingbird, or Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I mean, there's some great books in there. And schools that are being taken out because there's a word or because there's an idea that apparently somebody is going to be harmed by it, as though words, physically harm people. It's just such absurdity. No black child that I taught ever had a problem with To Kill a Mockingbird. It was the most popular book ever in schools. Yeah. So that's sad. The literature, and they're replacing it with this social justice claptrap where it's just, bad white kids tormenting some poor indigenous kid or calling her names or something. And she ends up triumphing over all the bad white kids. And the last one is just the defamation of the dead and the deformation of our history. And staining Canada, as I said, a genocidal state, and we have to have decolonialism and deconstructionism and essentially destroy. This idea we have to bring down the society that people around the world are wanting to come and be part of, because again, some radical and I think quite deluded, if not mentally ill, pathologically ill, leftists who brought into the classroom. And the worst example of all was my first one. The fact that I couldn't do anything about when they were working at schools to get the girls to change into boys and the boys into girls. I remember having this one girl, Ashley, and saying, "Can I call you Ashley? I don't really want to call you by your boy name." And she looked at me, and when nobody else was around, she said, "I'd rather be Ashley." Like she was just some kid caught up in it all, just being manipulated by bigger forces, Pied Pipers grooming in the school system. So anyway, allow me to get that out of the way. So there's nothing remarkable what I did. I said, again, the kids that died, they're going on and on about mass murder and schools for indigenous kids generation ago. And I simply said, as indicated earlier, that's not true. The kids were well cared for, many in an absolutely exceptional way. I think Christian men and women, were the only ones willing to even educate these kids. The residential schools are the ones that get, most criticized, and yet only a third of the kids ever went there. And for an average of just 4.5 years. So, and then there was a woman who wrote something nasty about me the other day. And because I said, again, just talking about historical truth. And she said that I traumatized her, and I set her back years in her therapy. And she said she's the 7th generation of a family where somebody's, where her great-great-grandmother, whatever, went for a couple of years at a residential school and learned English and how to read and write and how to sew and knit and cook. And it's just absolutely unbelievable. The lies, but that's the Orwellian thing. War is peace. Freedom is slavery. Ignorance is truth. It's just turning everything. The word equity. Oh my gosh, as though they're making something better with the word equity when it's just reified communism or I love this one, inclusion. When all they're doing is excluding people, and then diversity. When of course you step out of line, you do anything wrong. You don't wear an orange shirt on an orange shirt day, or a blue shirt, green shirt, black shirt, brown shirt, rainbow shirt, whatever shirt it is. There's just so much inculcation of these woke liberal tropes that it's frustrating.
Jim, I just noticed, I don't know if it happened yesterday or the day before, but I was scrolling through on X and I see a politician in BC tabled legislation to cancel this remembering the slaughtered kids, or the so-called slaughtered kids day that they have in BC. And they said it's nonsense. We have nothing to apologize for. And so what we're seeing is we're seeing this, and I look at it as a mind disease, to be honest with you, spreading all across Canada. In New Brunswick, I believe in the last week, there's been a land claim leveled for, I think, 750,000 square kilometers, like almost half of BC, or half of New Brunswick. Here in Nova Scotia, for example, I was able to uncover data by one of the province's top lawyers, a guy named Ella Cameron, and he was sent in by the premier to stop it was basically a peaceful protest natives had where they were blocking a salt mine thing in the Shubenacadie area. And he said, look, go solve the problem. Well, what he didn't know, this gentleman had written a book called Power Without Law, and he wrote it after the Marshall decision. And I didn't realize that the Marshall decision that gave a lot of different rights to Native groups, there was evidence in the archives, both in the United Kingdom here in Canada, that proved, for example, here in Nova Scotia, that the Mi'kmaq ceded all their land rights, hunting, fishing rights, and right to consultation. And I've read the documents and I have them. And so what happened is a decision was made in the Marshall case here in Nova Scotia by an activist judge who refused to allow all the evidence in the court. And so right now I have that data, and I'm looking for anybody in Eastern Canada who has to deal with the land claim. I can provide them with what they need to, if they can get it submitted into a Supreme Court case, will overturn a bunch of what the data proves are erroneous Supreme Court of Canada decisions based on inadequate and missing pieces of legislation. So you guys got a huge mess to deal with out there in BC, right? So my understanding is, I just want to go back to this. So you were the guy in a school in BC who were telling the kids, this is a lie, and here's what really happened. And tell us what next happened to you.
Well, within about 40 minutes, I had no idea I'd said something wrong outside of, there was two girls got very upset with me and challenged me. You're saying, it wasn't, the kids weren't tortured and murdered. And I didn't repeat myself. I said, look, I'm not trying to in any way cause any upset. I was at a new school. I was substitute calculus 12 teacher. I was not wanting to ever talk about residential schools because it's one of those issues where you just can't win. There's like teaching these days is a minefield in some subject areas. And my view is it's just all wrong. The idea that you have the indigenous people who don't pay taxes, most of them, because they're certainly the ones living in reserves, that were marginalized, rightly or wrongly, but were moved into the hinterland. They did not participate in the creation of British Columbia or the creation of Canada. And not that they didn't have a role to play, obviously, in the fur trade. They had a significant role to play, but I mean, it had nothing to do with Canada. And so people, because you would think it's a guilt, but most Canadians don't have any guilt whatsoever about what is being done for indigenous people. I think it's obscene. They get about $40 billion a year, and no other group gets anything. And it's based on race. And then in the classroom right now, I'm supposed to teach differently if I have an indigenous child before me. And I said, well, you're going to have to provide me with an ancestry kit. How am I going to know? I've taught so many indigenous kids in Canada who are probably 1% tops indigenous, blue eyes, blonde hair. I mean, it's just they've managed to go back in a genealogy test and all of a sudden, find that they won the lottery because they're the right race. So we're recreating South African apartheid, Hitler's Nuremberg laws. So when I come back to my story, so about 40 minutes later, I had two male vice principals come up to my classroom and say, pack your stuff and you're leaving. And I just thought, I mean, it's just so horrible for a teacher in front of your students to be treated like a criminal. And I didn't even know. And then they walked me down and tried to walk me out of the building, and without even answering me, without even telling me what I had done wrong. I had no idea. I'm a sincere teacher. I was a principal for a time. I won teaching awards. Like I'm not damaged goods. I didn't understand that at all. And they just refused to answer me. So I said, I'm going to make it easy for you. I'm not leaving the school until I talked to the principal. And so they realized that was a smart thing to do. Then they took me in front of the principal, and the principal said, this is what I said. This is what the girls objected, that the girls are being taught that there's, again, that these residential schools were killing fields right across Canada when they're nothing of the sort. They had international trips, they had reunions, they had, dance clubs and balls and orchestras and absolutely every single thing, hockey teams and basketball teams and soccer. They had everything schools did. And at Kamloops, the ground zero for this genocide, it had a huge Olympic-sized swimming pool right in front of the school.
Wow. Didn't know. These are some really big details that I'm not aware of.
And so when they said 215 kids, they were saying it to someone that I this is my area of interest and study. I've worked with our Prime Minister's father, Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister's father. Robert Carney was my thesis supervisor. Wow. And he said, he never said a single word wrong about any schooling for Indigenous kids, because they didn't have any schooling. And of course, it wasn't easy to know how to school them. They needed some residential schools because the kids, you couldn't, if you have a small nomadic band of 100 people, you can't all of a sudden bring up 12 teachers and a principal. And I mean, you just can't do that. So they had to have some, like with universities, you can't have a university in every small town in Canada or anywhere. And so kids sometimes have to move to get a good education. But the vast majority of these kids went to day schools, and then eventually all the kids went to day schools. So coming back to that one girl, I said that she was saying she was traumatized as the 7th generation. Wow. And I'm going, I mean, are you helping Indigenous people by making them into emotional hemophiliacs? That because, they're, again, a distant ancestor, went to a school and got an education, which is a fundamental, internationally proclaimed right for all children. Anyhow, it's kind of crazy. So just coming back to the thing, so where I'd love to say to you, again, as a teacher, if I'm a teacher in the classroom, and that's all you have in front of you today, you don't have some hot shot, this, that. I'm a teacher. I tried to get a university job, it didn't work out. So high school teacher, but I knew my stuff, and I never treated one child differently from another based on a birth characteristic. There was a child who was overweight, or a child who had buck teeth, or a child who was an albino, whatever the children were, that was completely irrelevant. And that's what Martin Luther King talked about being colorblind and judging people by the content of their character. And so schools have moved really completely away from that. And now as a society, as you know, my understanding about the I'm going to say Micmac, because that's how we refer to them. Yeah. Growing up in Nova Scotia, they're claiming the whole province. You have, again, people who didn't contribute to the construction of the province. People who didn't have the wheel, didn't have metal, didn't have literacy, didn't have all sorts of things, nails, hammers, axes, weapons of, quite useful compasses. I mean, they gained so much by Europeans and others coming over here, and they have the temerity to say, "Oh, and it's all ours now." And in Richmond, Peter, sorry if I'm jumping ahead, maybe one.
Go ahead.
But so there is a political party in British Columbia, and there's led by a woman who's got more strength than any other politician in Canada, named Dallas Brody, and she's saying, "Oh, sorry, I just don't understand this. So we're supposed to treat people differently on the basis of race. Oh, and they're supposed to, get approval like the mafia every time there's a pipeline or something through BC. They get to come in, and take their cut." And she said, "Oh gosh, no. When we get elected, we're going to get rid of the Indian Act. We're going to pressure the federal government to do so. We're going to get rid of Section 35 in the Constitution. We're going to make it very clear," and that's what 1BC means, that every single British Columbia is equal in dignity, equal in rights, equal in opportunities. And that's the heart of our Constitution. But then again, and sadly, my father was involved in the repatriation of the Constitution and the Charter and so forth, and he had a particular role in rescuing it from falling apart. It was something called the Kitchener Court with Chrétien and Romano. But anyhow, but what they did at the last minute is they just went woke, and they said, "Oh, well, we're going to, throw in something about with affirmative action. You can't just Section 15. You can't discriminate people on the basis of, religion, sexual orientation, all these things." And then they went, unless it's government policy and it's considered to be a good thing to do. So what they did is they rendered our Bill of Rights. That's really what our Constitution Act needed. They rendered our law that shrining our most fundamental rights. They have completely made a mockery of it. And then of course the governments are just hiring these lunatic leftist judges and arbitrators and adjudicators. And I mean, they come up with, so you got a young woman who was an equity hire named Barbara Young, who ended up making this decision in Richmond. And all of a sudden, this group that doesn't live anywhere near Richmond, never did. They said, oh, we used to go over and fish there. Yeah, right. You used to go over and hunt heads or steal fish because you didn't live there. You lived in the Cowichan, lived on the island. So they said, oh, no, we went actually at a fishing village. What? Once for 10 days. And that's all of a sudden you get $100 billion worth of advanced capitalist industry and land. It's all, obviously it's all, highly developed in Richmond, which is a very populous city south of Vancouver. So it just makes no sense at all. So thank goodness there is a party in Canada, and it is in BC. And when people say to her, well, BC never had, they never had treaties and they didn't cede the land. And she goes, well, that's not true, because there were some treaties, like with the Nuke on the island and the northeast corner of British Columbia and so forth. But she said, so what? They all ceded title when British Columbia became a province in 1958. In 1858. And so, yeah, there we go. We did it in 1858. You can look at it. The law is clear as can be. There's no one group with rights and privileges or whatever that others don't have. And it's just the strangest thing that you have to even explain this. And I don't think it's even to help Indigenous people. I think it's the worst thing for Indigenous people. All you're doing is making them into, as I said, into a racket in the reconciliation industry where they just sit at home and they hire lawyers, consultants, and accountants and all these people just to steal wealth from everybody else. But they're not doing the things that are going to make them feel better for themselves. They're not getting their children employed. They're not dealing with fentanyl. They're not dealing with sexual abuse and reserves. They're not dealing with young teen moms. They're not dealing with suicide. I mean, there's so many problems. There was a native pusher on the reserve near where I live who gave fentanyl to my nephew at 19 and killed him. Like, I mean, these reserves, not all of them, but many of these reserves are an absolute nightmare. And so you're not going to help them at all by just just throwing all sorts of money at them forever. And then again, in British Columbia, you're stifling the ability for people to ever even put a shovel in the ground.
So, Jim, I want to bring out a point here that I would say, just from what you said, this Christmas, you're probably not going to be on Premier Evie or Mark Carney's Christmas card list. Just saying. So one of the points that you brought up, I'd like to come back to, is that everybody should be equal. And you look at the last treaty in Nova Scotia that was signed with the Mi'kmaq. And that treaty they had to renegotiate two new treaties after what they call the main treaty, I think, of 1761, because acts of aggression. So they had a second treaty, and they fully submitted in writing to the Crown. And then after more further acts of aggression, they went after the province and said, look, we're going to have a treaty, and we'll fully submit. And in writing, it's very specific that it said you're to be treated exactly the same as all other citizens of the Crown. No special hunting rights, no special fishing rights, no right to consult, and you ceded all land. And here in Nova Scotia, it doesn't matter where you are, even on local radio stations, they'll say that we'd like to acknowledge we're on unceded land. And I'm looking for a public opportunity to stand up and say, well, I'd like to bring this to the floor that, in fact, I have documentation. And it's all the case data that Alec Cameron had put together to submit in court. And by the way, the province fired him for doing that. Then he sued the province for wrongful dismissal and defamation, and won one of the largest cases of that sort in Nova Scotia history. But he had to sign an NDA, and the government buried that data. Well, I was able to get my hands on the data and everything that he had put together for that case. And the case is very specific. Everybody in Nova Scotia is to be treated equally under the Crown with no special rights. Now, out west, it may not be as black and white, but I can tell you here in Eastern Canada, when you read the documents, the data is the data, Jim. It's a really big deal. And so down here, we have, I was a game warden down here and professional forest firefighter inside the provincial government for 29 years. And in my 3 postings, I worked with Mi'kmaq officers basically over my entire career. And I can remember when they had family members getting $40,000 a pop for having attended one of these schools, one of these native schools. And, basically it was, well, I'll give you an example. Justin Trudeau came down here not this summer, but I believe the summer, might have been this summer or the summer before. And he went to one of the reservations here in Wagmacook, what we used to call Waikagama. And he just passed out something like $179 million just because needed to buy votes. He said, well, you know what? We're not quite sure. And who owned what, but just because you guys have undergone hard times, he handed out $179 million. I think every man, woman, and child on the res got something like $75,000 or $79,000 just because. And so what happens is the treaty that's in place in Nova Scotia, the last viable treaty, and the documents are in the archives, like I say, in the UK and here in Nova Scotia. And I have them before someone in the government goes down and starts trying to destroy that data. And what's happening is we have activist judges, the same as you have in BC, that are relying on oral tradition over written data. And there's no place inside the judiciary system in Canada where anything oral can supersede something in writing. It just doesn't happen. So we've got activist judges that are going, well, you know what? Somebody recalled something here from 400 years ago or 350 years ago. And I think we should maybe go with that. When I can tell you from personal experience, most people I know can't get the story right from something that happened to them last weekend. I'm just saying. So what we're looking at is what you're talking about in the school systems. I talk about it in my book, The Redneck Conservative, and you talk about it in your book. And maybe we'll pop that up on the screen if Lee can pull that up. The name of your book is, what is it again, Jim? It's
The Scarlet Lesson.
The Scarlet Lesson. And in that, you do the same thing that I do, talking about in my book. And I talk about there's your book there. Where can you get that book, by the way, Jim?
It's on Amazon. Yeah.
So that would make a great Christmas present for somebody who's open-minded enough to start looking at data, right? And it's the same thing with my book. Look, I mean, I'm going to shamelessly plug your book and mine, because if you've got somebody out there and they're in the process of what we call waking up, or they're at least open-minded enough to start questioning, if you read The Scarlet Lesson, or if you read the book, The Redneck Conservative, How Conservatives Are Made, that'd be an ideal Christmas gift just to hand to somebody. And they may use it in a campfire, and you may lose some friends over it, but I would rather lose friends over trying to expose truths to them than let them stagger around in a position where they're subjected to lies, and they're basing life decisions on things that you and I and millions others know to be categorically false.
Yes, and just coming back to, again, being a teacher, so that people are seeing me, and this could be the once in a lifetime they see me. I'm a teacher, and how dare people treat kids differently, again, on the basis of things that they have no control over. People can't control their skin color, their ancestry, or all sorts of things. So this is just so wrong, and we've known for hundreds and hundreds of years it's wrong. And all of a sudden you've got this new religion from, I think you can call it the woke mind virus, but it's a really insidious thing, and it's in all our institutions. So I'm fighting it everywhere. So I'm going against, I'm going to be suing my union. I'm going to be suing my employer. I'm going to be suing my regulatory body. I'm just anyhow, taking no prisoners. I'm not worried at all about anything else right now. They're wrong. They know they're wrong. Now, coming back to the 215 kids in Kamloops, they said at the time that it was a mass grave, that some of the children were as young as 3, which is, the kids didn't go to residential school until age 7. They said that they were buried late at night by classmates as young as 6. They said all sorts of things. Do you think anybody who believed that, who walked around, with this on their lips, talking about genocide, mass grave, do you think they've apologized to anyone? You think they've done? No, this is what's amazing. And so they play with language, and now what the media is doing is saying, well, what was discovered in 2021 was suspected unmarked graves. What were probably suspected unmarked graves in the minds of some people. I mean, they just completely watered it down. No, what they said is that teachers at this school disappeared 215 kids, and no parent ever said a kid was missing from the school. There was no record of it. All the kids that did die while enrolled at the school, they didn't die at the school except for 2 kids, Pearl Joe and Adrian George, and both in accidents, very tragic, and there were inquests held, and nothing to do with it. The school wasn't at fault at all. In fact, Pearl Joe died drowning in the river, the Thompson River that flows around the school. And that's why they built this monstrous swimming pool, so they could teach all the kids how to swim, so no other kid would drown. I mean, it's just this fascinating thing, how they take things and they just completely turn it upside down. Yeah. And even today, people are going, well, okay, there weren't murders and there wasn't genocide at residential schools, but it was cultural genocide. And you go, what the hell do you talk about? Genocide is about killing people. It's not about culture. And you didn't kill any culture. That's just complete stupidity. They gained a second culture. And then they say, when you challenge them, they say, well, okay, there's no murder, but they were horrible. These residential schools, there was so much abuse and so much neglect, and kids were being starved, and they were subject to experiments. And then some people go, oh, there were hooks, and there were incinerators, and there were nooses, and anyhow, you get a whole range. It's just absolutely fascinating. The people can say things like that. They were going around at St. Joseph's Mission School in British Columbia and Williams Lake, that they can talk about the teachers had an electric chair. And of course, there's no evidence of that. There's no, and then I went and protested with some other people who are leading the charge on this, Mike Dallas Brody and professor named Francis Widdowson, who like me was fired. And kids were yelling at us, and it was on tape. And I said, what do you need even evidence for? People in Canada want to assume, I don't know, is this sort of deep religious need to repent about everything about themselves and their ancestors and life generally, and I think this is more the case, or really are we just all being duped by a bunch of clownish people at the top of our society who simply want a virtue signal because they think it's going to give them more votes and some sort of legacy. And I mean, it's just ridiculous. Trudeau went to apologize to one group of residential schools in the interior Chilcotin area of British Columbia. Went in on a horse. He wants to be Peter on a donkey or Christ on a donkey. I mean, it's just unbelievable. Taking a knee with George Floyd, taking a knee on a Catholic cemetery with a teddy bear in his hand. Like, really, you almost wonder if the people who are leading our institutions, it's not just our government, our media, but all institutions, you almost wonder if they're just playing, not just dress up, if they're cosplaying, they're better than everybody else. And this is their evidence of it. And this is what justifies the amount of money they get and the power, influence, and so forth. Because everybody else is worse. Everybody else is worse. And when they go after someone like me, I think if they could, they would have tarred and feathered me, or they would have vivisectioned me. They would have opened me up and taken out my internal organs. I mean, if the law allowed that, these people would do that because they want to show again how high and mighty they are. But in reality, all they're doing is perverting history and exploiting children sexually and all sorts of other evil things. So that's right in our schools. And one thing that I think is valuable to say, I talked to parents and others and grandparents and so forth. I'm telling you, do you know that, just last year there was a drag queen performing at your kid's school or something like that. And they always go, I'm going to go talk to the principal, or I'm going to write to the superintendent. And I'm going, oh my gosh, those are the people who are benefiting from the status quo. Those are the people who are doing this. It's the people in leadership positions within the school system and in every institution. They're the ones that are doing this. Don't think that the solution's ever going to come from the people at the top. It's going to be what Margaret Mead talked about, is, a small group of committed citizens. And so that's what I'm doing. That's what I'm dedicating, years of my life to. I'm not making any money doing this. I don't have a salary, but I'm making ends meet, and I'm just taking on absolutely all these charlatans and deceivers, and I think, truthfully, Pied Piper, wicked people who have harm in mind with children.
Well, Jim, I got to tell you, this is probably one of the most, what will go down in history as labeled one of the most politically incorrect interviews that we've done to date. But the key point that I want to point out, it may not be politically correct, but it is correct. Because every single thing you're saying is absolute, factually provable in the truth. And what's the biblical thing? The truth shall set you free. Unfortunately, there's so many people that are lodged sideways right now in the narrative that are profiting from what we're talking about, especially in the legal profession. For example, if you can find yourself involved in one of these cases, that's a license to print money that will be paid to you by the federal government, who will be on your side. Because what most people don't understand is the native population in Canada is a large voter bloc. And without that voter bloc, the Liberals lose power. And it's impossible for them to stay in power without that voter bloc. And whatever they have to spend, they will spend. Because the reality of it is, it's the worst form of reverse discrimination, personally, I've ever seen. And I've seen it firsthand down here in Nova Scotia. I want to point something out from coast to coast Canada, for example, and around the world. Canada's premier police force, the RCMP. When you apply to join the RCMP, for example, Jim, I believe the score on the test that they give you have to get 80. Unless you're a native, then the score is 50. And if you're a non-native, then you can take the court that you can take the application program once a year. If you're a native, you can take it every day till you pass. And if you can't pass, an officer will be assigned to you who works with you on a daily basis till you can reach that 50% plateau. And then congratulations, you're a new Mountie. And so in my book, there's a whole chapter about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in all societies are built on the premise that the most qualified people should gravitate to the top. And so what happens is, when you find, anytime that you start hiring people based on quotas, or you not being the most qualified person in the room to do a job, that's when I start worrying about driving across a bridge where one of the DEI hires was the engineer. I do not want to be on an airplane when the pilot is a DEI hire and he got hired because he was a certain race or a color or an ethnicity or certain religion. And so what's happening right now is, when I looked in that treaty data here in Nova Scotia, it's plain language. It's straight written out. Everybody is to be treated equal under the Crown unless granted a specific privilege. And there were no specific privileges granted in Nova Scotia. And now, I've got grandchildren, quite a few of them actually, and I asked them at different age ranges, so what are you being taught in school? And every single day they're told that we're on land that we stole from people who signed a contract after military aggression against the Crown, and they had to sign a contract to keep from being wiped out, is what happened all throughout Europe. Basically, every single country around the world was established through warfare at one time or another. I'm Scottish. Right? The Scots weren't getting along so good with the English when most of my relatives decided they'd come over to Nova Scotia. And I'm not going back looking for land claims and land titles. The issue that you guys have out in BC right now is actually finding its way. I just wanted to pop into this. There's a proposed class action that was just filed a couple of days ago, where property owners are suing the federal and provincial government in light of the Cowichan tribes decision. And so what they're saying is they were misled by the province and the government. And I've read documentation that said this case should never, ever have gone into court. And it appears that we have an activist judge who made a decision knowing exactly the problems that they were going to dig up. And I really don't see a solution. Can you go over how you see the problem, and what do you see in the way of a solution to this, Jim?
Well, I'm going to start with the latter part, if I may. I think, I respect you greatly for what you found historically and legally. I'm kind of to the point myself where, of course, that's important. But I'm kind of going, who cares? You obviously, morally, ethically, reasonably, you don't treat people differently in the basis of ancestry, particularly when many of the people you're giving you special rights to are 1% or less. Or, I mean, it's just so small. It's a speck of that. And then, of course, increasingly, many of them aren't at all. We've got two of the top Indigenous writers in Canadian history, Joseph Boyden and Thomas King, don't have a speck of Indigenous blood. So they're just, this is their
grifters.
Yeah, I mean, it's a game. It's a game. You've got people from India now with status cards because they come over here and they marry someone who's got a speck of Indigenous blood, and all of a sudden, all their children and grandchildren, name Rupinder or Muhammad or whatever, are full-blooded Indigenous and have rights that people like you and me. My family all came through Nova Scotia. My wife's family all did as well. That's normal. Right. Yeah. I'm largely Scottish. I'm a little bit Viking. I just want to come back and before the Richmond, just one thing there about the Iroquois. Not only did the Iroquois almost completely exterminate the Huron. The Huron were pushed right out of Ontario by the Iroquois, but they also exterminated other tribes, like the Mohicans and the Eries. Anyhow, we could talk about that another time. But they're not First Nations. They weren't in Canada. And the Sioux that came in 1876 after the Battle of the Little Bighorn with Custer, they came into Canada, and now they have all these special rights. When they came here 900 years after my first relatives, the Vikings came to Canada. The whole thing, people need to go stop. And yet what happens in schools, you can't even put an end to land acknowledgements because the people at the top are going to clobber you. Again, not because they care, but it's their way of having control. Whole systems are built in control. Keep power to be at the top. The word Islam means submission, and Muslim means someone who submits. So when everybody has a belief system like this wokeism, this cult, the people at the top aren't sincere and they're only looking out for themselves. But don't you dare open your mouth. You open your mouth. If you as a teacher, you're not going to get promoted. You're not going to get the right classroom. You're not going to get the right courses. You're not going to. Anyhow, there's so many punishments if you don't reproduce, if you don't become a shill, for the people above you. And then, of course, the principals in schools, they're the same way. They're just as frightened of the superintendent or the people in the school district office. And then those people are just as scared of people in the Minister of Education office. And it's just one person at the top comes up with a stupid idea that why don't we reorganize Canada based on people having a speck, perhaps having a speck of this one ancestry. So coming to Richmond. So this is what people in Nova Scotia and British Columbia and anywhere else have to do, in my view. They have to meet people like I did. So I went to the first town hall meeting for the people in Richmond that all of a sudden realized that they could no longer get a mortgage on their house. They could no longer sell their house at fair value, if at all. They no longer do they have entitled to it's not just private property. It's most Canadians' financial instrument. In fact, only financial instrument. I mean, they have a little bit in pensions or whatever. But most people, particularly when you get my age, your age, when we're tired, you need to have a house. You don't want to be paying mortgage when you're 80. You want to be able to downsize one day and be able to draw that money out and in case need be. I mean, to do that to people. So what Dallas Brody, the leader, again, the provincial party 1BC did, she said, she printed the names of all the members of the Legislative Assembly in my province who own a house or something, own property. And she says, since you're always saying you're on unceded, you're somebody else's land and Indigenous title is senior and all this stuff, all this hocus pocus, then give it away. You're the leaders, give it away. Say it, go right now and say, here, go to the local tribe and say, here, take the title of my land and I'll pay you property taxes and I'll pay you whatever you want me to do. Do that. Because if you don't do that, it's just a disgusting insincerity. It's like kids all day long in school. Sometimes it's not just once, by the way. You do land acknowledgements if there's an assembly, or if there's sometimes ball game after school, they do these.
And it's garbage.
And the kids are going, well, if you live, people are thinking they live on stolen land, then leave it, give it up. Like, it's just so horrible. It's like saying, as you know, I stole your bicycle. And they remind you every day for the rest of the time that I'm never going to give you back your bicycle. Like, I mean, there's just no way good. It's repetitive. It's, it's historically false, how things they say in these land acknowledgements. And yet we can't even get rid of land acknowledgements. I've been walking on land acknowledgements for years and years and years. I ran federally and provincially in the last year. And just to do that, just to have a big occasion where I could, in front of cameras, walk out of a land acknowledgement. But it hasn't taken off, but it's going to. It's absolutely going to. All of a sudden, we're going to hit a tipping point. And all Canadians are going to go, this is it. And then all of a sudden, the people who are imposing these land acknowledgements, who are talking about Indigenous owning all of Canada, they're going to be quickly going, oh, I never said that. No, I didn't want them either. No, that's true. Somebody, they told me I had to do this, but, I always was resisting. They're going to present themselves as virtuous again. But I mean, we're talking about morally corrupt individuals leading all our institutions, because you damn well know that you don't indoctrinate children in schools. You teach them to think, to question, to work hard, but you don't tell them what to think. And that's what we're doing. And then for all our institutions, it's the same thing. People have no choice, so they know they're going to get punished. So that's all going to come to an end. And I just hope soon, because if I keep getting older, I'll never teach again. It's already been 5 years since I last taught.
Well, I've got a little bit of Viking in me, and apparently you've got a lot in you, Jim. So I'm wondering where we get this fighting streak. But the reality of it is, I'm taking it on as a mission in Nova Scotia to make sure that when people make that proclamation that we're an unceded native land, I've got no problem rolling out the documentation and say, well, actually, this document says specifically that you ceded all land in Nova Scotia in your latest treaty, and it's spelled out and not in oral tradition. And we're using the meaning that was imposed on you back when the treaty was written, where it very plainly says you submit. And the submission document meant you submit, and we're all going to be treated equal. And the big thing that I have, Jim, is how can anybody, any politician, anybody stand up and say, well, no, we shouldn't all be treated equal. Well, no, we should all be treated equal. Now, don't get me wrong. It's not like I'm not for diversity, equity, and inclusion, where you don't, you're going to get it's not equality of outcome, but it's equality of opportunity. And if you're not good at what you do, it's much like in school today. I listened to a person explain to me about the marking system in school today. And I was flabbergasted as compared to when I was in school. And I remember being back in grade 4 and 5, every week some kid in our class got the strap. And when I was going to Catholic school, one of the nuns used to have a 1 meter long hardwood pointer stick. And a lot of time you didn't see that one coming. And we just grew up and every kid that got it had it coming to them. They had done something they weren't supposed to be doing. And the classrooms were behaved, and people didn't run wild. And I talk about it in my book. I was literally picked up in grade 8, walked off my feet, taken to the back of the classroom, thrown out the hall and bounced off the wall, fell on the floor. And the teacher said to me, you can go back in when you apologize. So the next day I went in, apologized, said, yeah, I shouldn't have said that, sat back down, and life carried on. Yeah, but back then, though, Jim, is every year some kids failed. And one of the best things that ever happened to them was failing, where they had to go back and straighten out their act and pay attention and actually get through the course. And some of them, if you push a kid through, if you don't understand the basics, from that point on, you can't learn anything else. It's just a catastrophe.
No, I'm very unhappy, but my particular complaint is with behavior. I tried to keep my job. I did the woke dance as much as I could for a number of years. And I never liked to fail students, because then you end up, the principal would call you into his office. And anyhow, it was very unpleasant.
Yeah.
So I found a way of getting kids to get 50, and then everybody was happy.
Okay.
But one year, and this goes back about 8 years, I had a boy, And he was a nightmare in the classroom. And he was so bad that he would do things like lie on his desk, in the desk of the person beside him, lie on his back, playing loud music and making all these strange sounds right in class. And so anyhow, I complained about the kid and all that kind of stuff. And they were afraid, the other teachers and principal were afraid of the mother. And so anyhow, they were working with him or whatever. But this kid became a nightmare, and he recognized that I was the only teacher that was complaining about him, and he didn't do a stick of work. So he keyed my car twice. The administration said things to me like, well, if you can look through the tapes of the parking lot, we don't have time to do that or whatever. They had no interest in, but the kid did a criminal activity twice against me, vandalizing my car. It cost thousands of dollars. Didn't care. And so, because it's all about, the principal knows that he has to, or she has to placate the parent and placate the kid, because the kid can influence the parent. The teacher's the one that doesn't matter. Anyhow, this kid ended up not being in my class for the last couple of weeks of the year. It's just terrible. And and he was supposed to do work. He never did it. So I failed him. The only kid I failed in recent memory, and gave him a mark of something like 30% or 35% or something. But there's summer school where we live, where kids with a mark of that or whatever can go and upgrade the course. So I wasn't really even trying to fail the kid. So anyhow, the next year at the school, I had left the school, but the next year I asked that kid, what happened with that kid? And they said, oh, he went back into, this is grade 9. He went back and he went into grade 10 social studies. And he said, well, how can he do that? He had a failing mark and he didn't go to summer school. And the teacher said, oh, the principal just changed his mark. Like, my point is that the system is not about teachers losing sight of their principles, of their pedagogy, of what they're supposed to do. It's the fact that increasingly you are being steered to do things that are clearly anti-education. Now, I noticed it's almost an hour, and I don't want to.
Yeah, we're down to our last 5 minutes, Jim. So with this last 5 minutes, I'm going to bring you back to the land claims issue in BC, how it's affecting Canada, and what do you see as a solution?
Well, I see the solution is to do what you're doing, which is to find legal documentation, political documentation, such as the founding of Nova Scotia as a province and BC as a province. It doesn't talk about special rights at all. It's certainly ceded land. You talk about it in rational ways. You can't have a successful democracy if you're treating people differently on the basis of ancestry or pretend ancestry. But I'm sort of a kind of a different way of looking at this. We have a communist running our province, and he wants to just give it all away to Indigenous people so he can feel good about himself. His name is David Eby. I don't understand him. I think he's very mentally ill, and so what he's done is he gave a whole huge series of islands called the Queen Charlotte Islands or Haida Gwaii just overnight. So that means that anybody who's not Indigenous living in those islands just lost the right to their own property, because the band can turn overnight. Is what they do is they take over the land, and then if they want to get rid of you, they just increase by 1,000% your heating costs or your water costs or something. Anyhow, so they're going to get rid of you, and all of a sudden, non-Indigenous Canadians are going to have nowhere to live in Canada. But he gave over Haida Gwaii. He gave over parts of the Sunshine Coast, which is the Vancouver coastline, not on the island, but on the mainland. And he's, Richmond, they want all of Kamloops back, which is interesting. They've taken half the city where I live, or town called Tsawwassen. And I mean, it's just unbelievable. This is going to be civil war. And so we don't want that. And we don't, I think it's the saddest thing is I think the Indigenous people are being used as in this, because this is not going to be good for them. People are going to hate them. And there is going to be an end to the Indian Act and any special privilege or anything they've ever gotten, because they push people too far. So if they want to end up with anything, at least for a few more years, anything in the way of special treatment, they better back down in a hurry, because this is not going to end well for them. And your average recent immigrant from China or India and all that, they're not going to be looking around going, oh, tell me, I came to Canada because it's got, British common law and and you have rights, and you're telling me I don't have those rights. Well, baloney, and using stronger language. I think it's just all Canadians have to. I said at the beginning, you have to have more courage. You have to just look at these politicians and institutional leaders in the eye, and you say, "Not over my dead body." I mean that, over my, or this is the hill I'm going to die on, as an employee, as a resident, as a neighbor, as a whatever. Not going to happen. I am not going to have my children distinguished or separated in my classroom based on race or ancestry. Not going to happen.
Well, Jim, I got to tell you, I admire your principle. I know that it's cost you dearly, but the reality of it is, you and I can both, when we shave, we can still look at the guy in the mirror. And my kids, one day, and your kids are going to say, you know what? My dad wasn't sitting back watching Netflix. They were actually up there making a difference. So for any of you guys watching out there, realize this affects all of us, what's happening here right now. You're going to pay a price to speak up. And I can tell you right now, if Bill C, I believe it's C9 that they're trying to get passed actually right now today, that they'll be allowed to censor what we just said right here. You and I, they may try to put us in the same re-education camp together, but I think our old Viking background will put an end to that. So in closing, guys, swing on over to Amazon, grab Jim's book and The Scarlet Lesson, and just actually, when you get an opportunity between now and the next month, as people start to gather, bring up some of these topics. Do not be afraid, because there's an awful lot of people who think like we think, Jim, who are afraid to speak up, and they just need to look around a room and find one other person who they can say, we never realize who we can inspire by speaking truth. And on that note, guys, we'll take you over to the next section. You don't want to miss this. Jim Ferguson, this last couple of weeks has been absolutely on fire. Do not miss this. Thanks for tuning in, Jim. It's been a real pleasure. You and I could probably talk for another 3 to 4 hours, but we have to let you go, and thanks very much.
Thank you so much.